So, this book. And I can't figure out this camera. Anyway, this has been very illuminating for me. It's the dealing with the Greek philosophers, pretty much starting with Socrates and going through the various schools that were formed after Socrates died: Stoicism, Epicureanism, Cynicism, Sophists, and I mentioned the Stoics already, probably. So it's been really enlightening for me. I know I read that preface of Hegel's to Phenomenology of Spirit, and in there I think is when he said you have to know something from the beginning and follow it all the way up if you really want to know it. And I think that's right, at least in this case. So it's been an education for me. I never really thought about what those ancient Greeks thought they were doing when they were doing philosophy. But now, what with Stoicism interaction, with the Stoicism website, reading this book, going through the Stoic Recovery website, where they're like a 12-step program, but it's Stoicism instead of 12 steps, and going through my own 12-step program. Kitty, be quiet. Some things have started making sense to me, or clicking for me. I think what the Greeks were doing, what they meant by philosophy, was really a very pragmatic praxis type of thing. Shut the freak up, kitty. Come here. It's a cat. It's causing all kinds of problems. But it's very praxis oriented, as opposed to like the German philosophers, which I don't know, maybe there is a praxis with them, and I just don't know what it is. But I didn't get that impression that that there was a real praxis involved in their philosophy. It was more you think, you write, you critique other branches of philosophy, the ones you're in opposition. Your thing about resistance was very on point here. You have to resist someone else's philosophy to have a philosophy of your own, and that seems to be the history of Western philosophy from Descartes on. Every subsequent philosopher was playing off of Descartes, and shut up! Just gonna jump up here any second now. The philosopher that came before was the grist in the oyster to make the pearl of the next philosopher. They would be in opposition to the philosopher that came before, and God bless a cat. And so I really enjoyed Chinese philosophy and Eastern philosophy because it didn't really do that necessarily. They weren't written in opposition to their thing, and they were very imagistic laden. They were about stories and sort of like biblical parables or what have you. But the ancient Greeks were kind of different too. They weren't really bringing their philosophies necessarily in opposition to the philosophy that came before, but they would have an alternate philosophy for the goal they all had, which was how to live the good life. From Socrates on, everybody seemed to be concerned with living the good life, and it's centered around virtue. There would be debates about what was virtue and how to obtain virtue, but that's what they were trying to do. And they were trying to mold themselves through philosophy to realize wisdom, which was how to live the virtuous life. So that started to make sense to me. And the Stoics, that's my vision of what Stoicism can be at its best. It's really designed, it seems to me, for a person who's living life with a lot of conflict. It's social conflict, spiritual conflict, geopolitical conflict, all those different conflicts. And Stoicism and Epicureanism and Cynicism all were Platonism, all were Aristotelian scientific pursuit. These are all to condition the individual to be able to live and deal with all the different levels of conflict he or she was going to face in her life. So what bothers me about that Stoicism website is like they keep referring back to, Epictetus or whatever, or Marcus Aurelius or Seneca, and saying, well, what would a Stoic do in X situation, Y situation? When it seems to me they should be in practicing the Stoic principles, which are designed to get them to a point where they don't have to refer back to anybody. They can figure it out for themselves, which is really the best way, because there's no situation is identical. So you can take this prospective situation you're dealing with and say, well, what would Marcus Aurelius do under these circumstances? Well, it depends on a lot of factors, and you can't just plug some saying in that he wrote down in his diary that was only meant for himself and dealing with his particular situation, and extrapolate from there and say, okay, he says to do X under Y conditions, and this seems to be Y conditions, so I'm going to do X. That doesn't seem to me to be the way to go about it. But they're handing you a handbook on how you develop yourself to gain this wisdom for yourself, and then you can decide. You can weigh all the factors, and you will have a better idea what to do. So I think the way I look at it, and the way I would want to proceed from, and have been proceeding for quite a while now, but not really necessarily realizing it or verbalizing it, is that we all have an instrument inside of us. You might call it conscience, you might call it a soul, you might call it your ego, but that's not it. No, you wouldn't call it the ego. So it's some thing that's doesn't really feel like it's necessarily me, or not the ego me, maybe the broader, more expansive version of me, but it doesn't really feel like it's me. But it's that thing maybe that Socrates was talking about, that small voice that spoke to him and told him what to do. I mean, isn't that the dream of every philosopher mired in arbitrariness and relativity, to have something inside that would say, do this, do that, and you don't argue with it, you just do it. So I am operating now under the hypothesis that I do possess a thing like that, and most people do. I think there may be some exceptions to this. If you are not a normal person and you don't act normally, you don't socially integrate normally, you may have some sort of personality, what's called a personality disorder. Maybe you don't have that thing inside you, that guide or that feeling or voice or whatever that can direct you which way to go. But most of us have it. The problem is, and where we go off, is that our own character defects, our own difficulties obscure that thing, and we either don't listen to it, or we can't hear it, or we hear it but we ignore it. And I think all the Greek philosophers were telling you how to clean that instrument off so that it will work effectively and be a guide for you that you can rely and follow. So that's what philosophy was for the early Greeks. By my way of looking at it, they were all trying to tell you, you've got this, virtue. You've got this virtue detector inside of you. And it's going to tell you what the virtuous way is, as long as you clear out all the distractions and get rid of everything that's non-essential, and live your life according to that guide. And Stoicism is one method. Socrates, I don't know if that's what Socrates was really doing. His goal was just to make sure everyone knew that they were not wise, and he seemed like that was his calling. And I don't know if that was his way of the dialectic and the conversations he would engage in. I don't know if that was his way of cleaning his instrument continually and making sure that cat out and making sure that he was always aware of what was what. But I know Aristotle, Plato, Zeno or Zenon or whoever it was that founded Stoicism, they were all forming their academies or schools with an eye to teaching how to cleanse and de-obscure whatever it was inside of you that would make those determinations of what's virtuous, what's good, and how to follow it. And it seems pretty clear to me. The 12-step program is exactly the same thing. It's a program with, I laid out pragmatic steps of action, things that you do to eliminate your character defects, to get your head right and clear your mind. And it's a subjective thing. Whoever really knows if it's really having that effect or not. But it seems to me like it is. It seems to me like my mind was the instrument inside me that I used to detect which way to go and do the right thing and follow the good and not follow the bad. It seemed to me that was greatly obscured by multiple character defects, and there's a program laid out. This is how you get rid of those character defects. If you do it, you're going to get rid of them. If you don't do it, maybe you get rid of them, I don't know, but it doesn't seem like it's quite as likely. So, and then I've been listening to this Books on Tape about Alexander, and that's really been illuminating. He was of course was a student of Aristotle's. Aristotle would have trained him how to clear the debris out of the way of his instrument so that it was able to detect what's the good, what's the right way to live. And if this biography is at all accurate, he certainly did set out to do that. Now, in some bizarre ways at some points in time, and you may question his methodology, but I think it's pretty clear that he was an unusual ruler, and he had unusual ideas about what you do with conquered peoples and how you treat them, how you treat your own men, how you want them to view you. All, if this biography, and who knows, to be believed, a very unique presentation to the world of a conquering king or whatever. So that is further fitting in with the way I'm choosing to look at this right now. And I'm just going to continue reading. I think a really interesting thing was the Socratic dialogue that Plato proposed as a methodology where two people engage in dialogue not to defeat each other, not to prove one point over the other, but in a sincere attempt through mutual conversation to get at the truth or the good or the virtuous or whatever. And that was a very exciting thing. Now, there's not much recourse to that. I don't know where you find such a where you find a conversation partner or partners to engage in that kind of practice. Usually it's a master student relationship, or two people are taking opposite sides, or what they think are opposite sides, and trying to either make the other person look like a fool or ostensibly convince them of their viewpoint, which never happens, or defend their ground, and it's not very productive. Now, I don't know if any other way would be more productive, but the Platonic notion of how dialogue and dialectic would work was very intriguing, and to form a whole academy along those lines and have that kind of activity going on would be, I would think, wonderful. But I'm just going through the different schools right now. I'm in about 320 BC, or I don't know, somewhere around in there, 300 BC. So I've got about 2,300 years to go before I catch up to you. So I'd like to ask you to wait, but I suppose you've got to move on at your own speed. But that's what I think about the Stoics, kind of. And I don't know how coherent that all is, or how interesting it is. It seemed really interesting to me at 3:30 this morning when I was going through my mania and deep breathing, trying to get to sleep, get back to sleep at some point, which I didn't accomplish this morning, but it's all right. I got 5 hours or so, which seems to be adequate under most circumstances. So anyway, I'm gonna take a breath here. But I enjoyed your talk. It's very evocative and a lot to think about. But your way of looking at things, it's not my way, but it's a way that I can, to some extent, feel like I tap into. I don't know that I do, and like you say, these things are hard to comprehend, and perhaps we're forming our Wittgensteinian language, but we're sharing sort of a Wittgensteinian language, but we each have our own language coming off of that common language that we're sharing. So it's only understandable to us, and not communicable, perhaps, but you can get the feeling that you're communicating it, which can be just as good, I suppose. But all right, I'll try and figure out how to shut this thing off and post it, but we'll see if this works.